This remains one of the most enduring mysteries in Chinese history. As the Qin Empire faced the abyss of destruction and the land was engulfed in the flames of war, when every faction threw their last ounce of courage and flesh and blood into a brutal, decisive struggle, where was that invincible Qin army that had once swept across the realm and unified the Six Kingdoms? History tells us that the Northern Frontier Army maintained its absolute loyalty. They abandoned the Great Wall defense line and marched south to rescue the empire, only to be completely annihilated by Xiang Yu at the Battle of Julu. But what of the other elite force? What of the Lingnan army that had swept south, conquering everything from present-day Shanghai all the way to northern Vietnam? With a massive force of 500,000, enough to turn the tide of the entire war, why were they absent from the battle for the Central Plains? Let us explore the story behind this enigma and uncover the intricate ties between these 500,000 Qin soldiers and Vietnam today. In the late autumn of 209 BC, chaos erupted in the Grand Palace of Xianyang. The second emperor of Qin and his high ministers were in a state of panic. A rebel army of hundreds of thousands, ragged but battle-hardened, had somehow broken through the legendary Hangu Pass, a fortress said to be impregnable. Now they were sweeping through the heartland, their vanguard already at the Qi River, just a mere 50 kilometers from the capital. The Great Qin Empire, a behemoth that had just swallowed the world and believed it would endure for 10,000 generations, suddenly found the Reaper's scythe at its own throat. The second emperor looked at his court and asked a question that plunged him into despair. Where are our county militias? Where are our main armies? It was a colossal irony. The first emperor had spent decades forging a hyper-militarized empire, but now, at its very heart, the Guangdong region, there was a fatal military vacuum. The first emperor had been too confident and too greedy. To maintain his vast domain, he had pushed all of his elite forces to the farthest frontiers. Now the capital was practically an empty city. In desperation, the court official Zhang Han stepped forward. He proposed a radical idea: conscript the convicts and slaves laboring at the emperor's mausoleum to form a new army. The court agreed without a second thought, but everyone knew they were a mob. They might slow the rebels' advance with their flesh and blood, but they could never stop the true armies of vengeance led by the nobles of the old conquered states. For the Great Qin to survive, it needed to summon its true legions. On the vast, war-torn map of the empire, 2 points of light still shone. They were the 2 trump cards left by the first emperor, and in the second emperor's eyes, they were his last hope. The first was in the north, the Great Wall Army, 30,000 strong, hardened by years of brutal warfare against the Xiongnu nomads. They were the empire's sharpest spear. The second was in the south, the even larger, more mysterious Lingnan army. Historical records claim this force numbered a staggering 500,000 men. A decade earlier, they had been sent south to conquer the jungle tribes of the Baiyue. It was a force capable of sweeping across the entire continent. The second emperor, jolted from his dream of a self-sustaining fortress, now desperately needed his father's 2 armies. Without hesitation, he dispatched his highest-ranking messengers. 2 groups of envoys, with feathers in their caps and golden tablets of authority, galloped out of the beleaguered capital. One rode north towards the Great Wall, the other rode south towards the sweltering jungles. The fate of the empire now rested on the hooves of these few horses. Soon, news came from the north. The commander of the Great Wall Army, Wang Li, had been waiting for the call. Upon receiving the edict to save the king, his legion acted with astonishing efficiency. They made a huge sacrifice for the empire, abandoning the defensive lines they had held for years, even at the risk of a renewed Xiongnu invasion. Even while the main army was still gathering, Wang Li dispatched 2 of his top generals with a mobile vanguard force to race south to Qianyang. They were immediately integrated into Zhang Han's Lishan army, becoming the professional military backbone of that convict force. Then, after completing its mobilization, the main body of the Great Wall Army, a black tide of iron and steel, swiftly marched south. It was their arrival that gave the Qin forces a brief, brilliant resurgence on the battlefield, crushing numerous rebel leaders, including the formidable Xiang Liang. The northern army had not failed the empire, but everyone was still waiting for the other, much larger force. If 300,000 men from the Great Wall could turn the tide, what would happen if the 500,000-strong Lingnan army appeared on the battlefield? The defenders of Xianyang scanned the southern horizon daily. Zhang Han, in the lulls between brutal battles, prayed for the sight of their black dragon banners. But a month passed, then 2, then 6. The messengers sent south had vanished as if swallowed by an abyss. Not a single echo was heard. No sound of marching hooves, no rumble of supply wagons, not even a verbal reply. The great Lingnan army, 500,000 strong, had disappeared from the face of the earth. Let's turn back the clock to 223 BC. The state of Chu, the largest and most stubborn of the warring states, had finally fallen. The commander of the victorious Qin army, Wang Jian, grandfather of the Great Wall Army's commander, Wang Li, was at the pinnacle of his career. But before the smoke of battle had even cleared, an urgent edict arrived. Surrender your command. The old general wisely complied and retired. But what to do with his 600,000 battle-hardened soldiers? Disband them? No. For the ambitious first emperor, unifying the Central Plains was just the beginning. His gaze was already fixed on the blank space at the southern edge of the map. A year later, a new order was given. The first emperor took 300,000 of the most elite troops from the army that conquered Chu and reorganized them. Their new commander was a notoriously ruthless general named Tu Sui. His mission? March south, cross the 5 ridges, and extend the Great Qin's administrative system to the very ends of the earth. The army marched into the south, but they soon discovered an enemy unlike any they had ever faced. The historical texts refer to the diverse peoples of this vast southern land as the Baiyu. This was not a single nation, but a multitude of tribes living in the endless jungles and river networks. They didn't build walled cities, they lived in stilt houses. They didn't fight in disciplined phalanxes, but every one of them was a natural-born special forces soldier, moving through the dense jungle like monkeys and through the rivers like otters. For the Qin army, accustomed to large-scale warfare on the northern plains, this was an alien world. Initially, the Qin advance was unstoppable, but when they pushed deep into the territory of the Western Ou people, near the modern border of Guangxi and northern Vietnam, the war turned savage. The Western Ou leader was killed, but his people did not surrender. They vanished into the mountains and began a brutal guerrilla war. For the next 3 years, the Qin army was trapped in a nightmare. The histories describe their plight. The army was useless, unable to advance. For 3 years, the soldiers dared not even take off their armor or unstring their bows. Then, one moonless night, the Yue warriors launched their final assault. They cut the Qin supply lines and surrounded their main camp. In the chaotic battle that followed, the once-invincible Qin commander, Tu Sui, was killed. The Qin army was routed. It was the most devastating defeat the first emperor had suffered since unification. But amidst this carnage, a young second-in-command was watching, learning. His name was Zhao Tuo. He was barely in his 20s, a native of the northern province of Hebei. He watched his commander's belief in brute force lead to annihilation. He watched his fellow soldiers from the dry northern plains die from the bite of a single mosquito. He saw that this savage land possessed a wild strength that the civilized world could not conquer by force alone. In those countless nights of terror, Zhao Tuo must have asked himself, can this land truly be conquered by killing alone? The death of Tu Sui marked the complete failure of the first emperor's initial plan, but it also cleared the stage for the young man from Hebei. He would rise from the ashes of this defeat and, in his own way, begin a legend. One of the main reasons for the Qin's defeat was logistics. Crossing the 5 ridges to supply an army was a nightmare. Qin Shi Huang, in a display of his terrifying willpower, didn't retreat. Instead, he ordered the construction of a marvel of engineering, the Ling Canal. This canal connected the Yangtze and Pearl River systems, creating a water highway that stretched from the heart of the empire to the deep south. In 214 BC, the Second Southern Campaign began. The new commander was Ren Xiao, and this time he led a reorganized and even larger force, a staggering 500,000 men. Fueled by the endless supplies from the canal, the second invasion was a swift and brutal success. The Qin established 3 new commanderies in the conquered lands: Nanhai, Guilin, and Xiang. The Nanhai commandery covered most of modern-day Guangdong, the Guilin commandery most of Guangxi. But the most significant was the Xiang commandery. Its territory was vast, stretching from southern Guangxi deep into modern-day northern Vietnam, into the fertile Red River Delta around present-day Hanoi. The war was over, but the 500,000 soldiers received no orders to return home. The first emperor needed not just a conquest, but a colony. The great fusion of the Qin soldiers and the Yue people began. The first problem to solve was a biological one. The army was almost entirely male. The emperor sent 15,000 women from the north to be wives for the soldiers, but it wasn't enough. With the tacit approval of their commanders, the Qin soldiers began to marry local Yue women. And in this wave of integration, no one was more thorough than the young man from Hebei, Zhao Tuo. After the victory, while the commander Ren Xiao governed the entire region, Zhao Tuo was made the magistrate of a key strategic county. As an official of the Great Qin, he took off his heavy official robes and wore the light, simple clothes of the Yue. He unfastened his top knot, the symbol of civilization, and tied his hair in the local fashion. He stopped speaking of harsh laws and punishments, and instead sat with the local Yue chieftains, drinking their rice wine and calling them his brothers. He respected their customs and honored their elders. To the conservative Qin officials, this was a betrayal of his culture. But to the Yue people, this northern giant was no longer a conqueror. He was one of them. Zhao Tuo was quietly building his own power base, his own prestige, loyal not to a distant emperor, but to the land he had come to love. When that urgent plea for help from Xianyang finally arrived at Commander Ren Xiao's desk, history poses a heavy question. According to the official Chinese histories, the story is simple. Ren Xiao was on his deathbed. He summoned his subordinate, Zhao Tuo, and told him, "The central plains are in chaos. This southern land is defensible. It is fit for a king. I wanted to seal the passes and declare independence, but I am dying. You are the only man for the job. I now entrust this land to you." With that, he handed over his authority and died. Zhao Tuo, following his last wish, immediately sealed the passes, purged the disloyal Qin officials, and declared himself the master of the South. It's a smooth, convenient story, but it is almost certainly a lie, written by the victor. Let's look at the logic. Ren Xiao was a top commander. Zhao Tuo was a mere county magistrate. Why would a dying general bypass all of his senior officers and hand supreme power to a junior official hundreds of kilometers away? And why would a loyal general, appointed by the first emperor himself, suddenly turn traitor on his deathbed? To solve this puzzle, we must understand the nature of this army. Why did the northern army march to save the king, while the southern army refused? The answer is in their composition. The Great Wall Army was composed of professional soldiers whose families and homes were back in the Qin heartland. They marched south to save the king, but also to save their own homes. But the Lingnan army was a different beast. The histories tell us it was a complex mix. It included elite marines and crossbowmen, but a large portion of the army was made up of convicts, indentured sons-in-law, and merchants, the outcasts of Qin society. They had been exiled to this savage land to fight and die. Miraculously, they had survived. They had married Yue women. They had children. They had been given land. For the first time in their lives, they had a home. And now, the empire that had abandoned them was demanding they return to die for a tyrant? To go back to being convicts and outcasts? And who would protect their new families from the resentful Yue tribes if they left? For these 500,000 men who had now gone native, home was no longer in the north. Home was here in the south. Understood in this light, The scene at Ren Xiao's deathbed looks less like a peaceful succession and more like a carefully planned military coup. It is highly likely that when the order to march north arrived, the army split. The high-ranking loyalist officers wanted to obey. The rank-and-file soldiers and the local officers like Zhao Tuo, who had integrated with them, refused. Ren Xiao was caught in the middle. And then Zhao Tuo made his move. The most chilling piece of evidence comes from the historical record of his first action after taking power. It wasn't to defend the border. It was to purge the Qin officials. Who did he kill? The Qin-appointed officials. If this was a peaceful transfer of power, why the bloody purge? The truth is clear. Zhao Tuo eliminated the pro-Qin faction, the men who insisted on marching north. He used the dying Ren Xiao's name as a cover, seized control, and sealed the passes. This is the truth of why the Lingnan army never returned. By the time the call for help arrived, the Qin's Lingnan army no longer existed. In its place were 500,000 settlers who had chosen a new home and a new leader. In 207 BC, the same year that the main Qin army was annihilated in the north, the same year that Liu Bang entered Xianyang and the Qin Empire officially died, Zhao Tuo completed his conquest of the 3 southern commanderies. In Vietnam's The Complete Annals of Great Viet, this year, 207 BC, is marked as the beginning of an orthodox dynasty for the country, the Trio dynasty, or Na Trio. For the next century, while the north was ravaged by civil war, the southern lands under Zhao Tuo's rule enjoyed 93 years of peace. He lived to be over 100 years old, outliving the Qin emperors, outliving Xiang Yu and Liu Bang, outliving the entire founding generation of the Han dynasty. He was no longer a Qin general, he was King Wu of Nanyue, the southern Yue. In 111 BC, the great Emperor Wu of Han finally sent his armies south and conquered the kingdom. In the Chinese histories, this is just a story of a local separatist regime. But in the historical narrative of Vietnam, Zhao Tuo and his kingdom are a source of intense and bitter debate. To the Vietnamese people, is Zhao Tuo a founding father or a foreign invader? If we travel back to ancient Vietnam, say to the 15th century, the answer is surprising. In the official histories of the time, Zhao Tuo's dynasty was considered the legitimate beginning of the Vietnamese state. They revered him as Emperor Wu of Trio. Why? Because to them, what mattered was independence. Zhao Tuo, though a Han Chinese, had dared to stand up to the Han emperors. He represented southern resistance against northern domination. But in the 20th century, with the rise of modern nationalism, Vietnam's view of its own history was turned upside down. Modern Vietnamese historians began to re-examine the story. Zhao Tuo was a Han Chinese from Hebei. He was a Qin general. He conquered the local Vietnamese kingdom. The state he founded was ruled by a Qin elite, used the Chinese language, and implemented Chinese systems. A new conclusion was born. Zhao Tuo was not a founding father. He was a foreign invader. In today's Vietnamese textbooks, his dynasty is no longer considered a legitimate part of their history. It is classified as the beginning of the Bac Thuoc, the period of northern domination. The man who was once the founding emperor is now seen as the man who began 1,000 years of foreign rule. Those 500,000 Qin soldiers were not pioneers, they were colonizers. This shift in perception profoundly reflects a nation's struggle to define its own identity. Do you choose a tradition of political independence, even if its founder was a foreigner? Or do you choose a narrative of native ethnic purity? Modern Vietnam chose the latter. But history leaves indelible marks. Modern genetic studies have shown that the Vietnamese gene pool is a hybrid. The foundational layer belongs to the ancient Yue tribes, but there is a significant and undeniable influx of Han Chinese genes, particularly in the paternal Y chromosome lines, consistent with waves of male immigration from the north, including, of course, the soldiers of the Qin and Han. So, from a biological perspective, those 500,000 Qin soldiers and their descendants, through 1,000 years of intermarriage, did indeed become a significant part of the ancestral makeup of the modern Vietnamese people. They did not disappear. They dissolved into the bloodline of the nation. And perhaps the most direct evidence is in the name itself. Vietnam. Vietnam, Southern Yue. Nam Viet.